would they impact visually impaired students more than, for example, dyslexic students? Is there this difference? What can you say about that, about the impact to different students? Anyone can answer.
I don't know if Miriam would like to go first, or shall I go ahead?
Oh, you go first, please.
Right. Well, it's not easy to answer how assessment is going to impact students. It's quite unpredictable in many ways, I would say. And if you remember at the beginning of my talk, I said that even students with specific learning difficulties can be so different from each other, and there is so many different types of learning difficulties, and they can have different severity. So there might be students who are less impacted because their learning difficulty is less severe, and there might be students who are more severely impacted by assessment. And the question is also, what kind of tools do you use to assess these students? And if you, as I, in my talk, I mentioned, if you use a lot of spelling tests, a lot of vocabulary tests, and fewer speaking tests, fewer skills-based tests, fewer portfolio assessment, then students are going to be probably quite negatively impacted, and they might experience failure, and that can kind of result in a vicious circle that they feel that they have failed, and then they lose their motivation, and then they learn even less. So then in the end, that's going to be failure, loss of self-confidence, loss of motivation. So it very much also depends on the type of the assessment practices that you use, and how you give feedback, how supportive that feedback is to the students, how you can highlight strength in that feedback, for example, and see errors more like areas for development rather than mistakes that should be eliminated and done away with. And I have less experience with visually impaired students. They need different types of support than students with specific learning difficulties. So again, sometimes it's easier to adapt to visible learning difficulties or visible disabilities than invisible ones like dyslexia, because as a teacher, you don't have to identify or diagnose if someone has a visual impairment or if someone has a hearing impairment, because you would know it when the student starts studying with you. Whereas with the learning difficulties, it might be the case that students do relatively well still in their first language, and they come to you and you have to identify that the student has a learning difficulty. So these are my thoughts on this. And I'll pass it on to Miriam.
Thank you, Judit.
Yeah, I do agree with Professor Judy. Yes, really, the invisible disabilities are very hard to deal with because you don't know how much it affects the student's performance or not. I'm going to talk about one experience we had at university. Our legislation permits that deaf students take the university entrance examination using Brazilian Sign Language, right? So we had 6 students being approved, one of which only knew sign language. High school failed when it did not teach this student to go from Brazilian Sign Language to Brazilian writing and reading. Portuguese writing and reading. So the student only knew how to use sign language. So he took the university entrance examination. He took and named the national examination using sign language only. He was approved. He got a good grade on it. He was approved he was accepted at university. But when he started studying, he couldn't read or write in Portuguese. He could only use sign language, and he wanted a translator to be with him 24 hours a day, which is impossible because this translator would have to read books and books and books to him, translate books and books and books to him to Brazilian Sign Language and vice versa, then writing. So eventually the student dropped out. So I think, Gladys, it depends on the purpose of evaluation. Why are you evaluating? When you have achievement tests like in classroom, you just want to know how the student is going on, if the student is learning, if you need extra activity, complementary, supplementary, blah, blah, blah. But in large scale exams, it really depends on the purpose. So this student, for instance, this deaf student who only knows sign language, couldn't cope with all the assignments he had to at university and had to give up.
I understand. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Now I'm going to raise another issue, but feel free to interrupt me if any of you wants to raise an issue or ask a question, right? You know, one thing that called my attention was the read aloud thing, the read aloud strategy. And I was thinking that some years ago, reading aloud was completely, banned from classrooms as a not productive activity. And nowadays we see how important reading aloud is. So I'd like you to talk a bit about that coming back of reading aloud to help us with the inclusion of students with special needs.
All right, so I would just like to clarify, but that read aloud doesn't mean that the student is reading out loud. It means that the student is listening to a text which is being read out loud to him. So it's basically multimodal or bimodal exposure to the text, which is different from asking our students to read out loud, which dyslexic students actually find quite challenging, especially if they have to do it in front of a class. I generally advise not to do that. If students have problems decoding a text, they are paying so much attention to the text itself. They are usually reading subvocally, so they might be actually moving their mouth, but they are not verbalizing it, and they can't really pay attention to, especially in English, decoding the words, pronouncing them correctly, and then paying attention to the meaning. The read aloud when there is multimodal exposure can definitely help students understand text. It has also some disadvantages, because if you think about reading as an activity, you can always go back and reread if you haven't read something, and you can read at your own pace. With reading aloud, so with bimodal exposure, your eyes actually have to follow the text as you're listening. So that means that if you have to go back while you're listening, then it can be actually very disturbing because you lose the thread. So you really have to make sure that the bimodal exposure is not disturbing the students. So for example, for good readers, it might be disturbing because they read faster than actually the text being read out loud to them. So it's not, it's not a panacea, it's not a solution to everything, but it can be helpful. It's one way to support students.
True, yeah.
I loved listening this from you about the multimodal, bimodal exposure. It really makes sense. Really interesting. Then something, when you said that, something came to my mind. My students who read Braille, they asked us to send them audios of the text plus Braille, because they wanted to read Braille and listen to the text. So that makes a lot of sense. They asked us to do that, and I didn't understand why. Now that you're talking about it, now it's really understandable. It's really interesting, really interesting. And I myself, after learning this with them, I use the screen reader. So if you use the screen reader, you can go back. You just touch with your finger the place you want to go back, and it goes blue. It goes back, and it has helped me a lot improve my language and my reading ability as well. So yes, thank you for your comment. Yes, the multimodal exposure is really interesting.
Yes, especially with Braille, right? It's actually also kinesthetic and listening. And thanks for mentioning that you can actually go back with this with some screen readers, which is great. And it again shows how different accessibility tools have moved over to kind of universal design. Because, for example, if I think back to 10, 15 years ago, you know, TV programs were captioned to help people who have hearing difficulties, right? And now you have captions everywhere, and we all read captions often together with the audio input. So I think we can always learn from different areas of disabilities how we can support students. And with English, the other advantage of read aloud or audio exposure is because the written form and the spoken form of words can be quite different. So because English spelling is non-transparent, it really helps the students with acquiring how the words are pronounced, because otherwise, you know, you might just see the written form and you may have no idea how that word might be pronounced.
Can I add something to that?
Yes, go ahead.
The multimodal exposure is not only good for students with disability, but with neurotypic students. I see my son and my in-law when they watch videos, because we have a lot of video classes now, and they speed up the speech, the microphone, not the microphone, I'm sorry. They speed up the talk. Instead of one, they go blah, 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 blah. And I even ask them, do you understand what they're saying? Says, yes, we do. And it's interesting because that's a strategy they've been using to study. So they follow the text and they listen to that very fast, and they're neurotypic. So it's, yes, I think it should be done not only with disabled students, but with neurotypic students. Why not?
Yes, a lot of the things I think we have been talking about are helpful for everybody. And you know, I also mentioned briefly the self-pacing of listening input. You know, some students might actually slow it down, or for some speakers, you actually need to slow them down because they speak so fast. But for some speakers, and this is what my own daughter also does sometimes with university lecturers, especially if lecturers talk very slowly, she speeds them up. So yes, we need to allow students this control, for example.
Now, I would like to listen to you about this wave we have, especially in Brazil, Judit, about bilingualism and plurilingualism. So we know it's a challenge to have children learning 2 languages, 3 languages. We have content learning, etc. So how do you see this and the problems or the challenges for students with special learning needs and disabilities?
Yes, so it's again, it's not an easy question. I mean, I definitely think that learning an additional language is helpful for everybody, and we shouldn't exclude anyone from learning additional languages because it can raise students' phonological awareness. It can help them even with some first language skills in the long run. It widens their horizon, intercultural awareness, etc. So there are huge benefits from learning additional languages. We might want to think about early exposure, whether that is helpful for students who are still struggling with their first language literacy skills, and and in general how early one should start with bilingualism in instructed programs. There is research that suggests that very early start doesn't give such an advantage, and perhaps that might be a disadvantage for students with disabilities. There are immersion programs as well. And sometimes, parents are recommended, for example, not to enroll their children in such immersion programs or bilingual programs or international schools if they seem to have learning difficulties. I would be against this recommendation. I think students can excel in these contexts as well, but you need to put support in place. And then you also need to think about, okay, so are the students acquiring even a third language, and what are the challenges with that? And if a student is struggling in their first language, then they are already struggling in the second language, then you really need to think about it carefully, whether you need to learn a third language. I don't know if that's a requirement in Brazil. It's a requirement in many European countries to learn a language additional to English, especially in secondary schools. But for you, maybe it might be easier if the third language is Spanish or Italian. Maybe students with dyslexia can excel in those languages and rather than in English. So that might actually be also be thought about, right? What is that second language in the Brazilian context, for example, that you're teaching to those students? Is what is more useful for them? Maybe Spanish might be easier for them. It might be more useful depending on what sphere of work they are going to be taking up a job in. So these are all considerations that depend on the context as well.
Yes, I do agree with Judy. It depends on the context, and it depends on the expectations. What is your expectation in terms of proficiency level you want your student to achieve? So if the student can learn how to speak the basics in Spanish, why not? He doesn't have to be a native Spanish speaker, for example, right? And in Brazil, we have immigrants from all over the world. So depending on where you are in Brazil, German is more advisable. 13 Tilhas, Pomerode, depending on the town you're at, they speak German more than Spanish. So I think it depends on where you are in Brazil. And I think it depends on the expectancy, what you expect from student. And I've seen some autistic students doing really well in foreign languages. I mean, really well. I wasn't expecting that much. And if they can learn the basics, why not? I think everything is a question of where you want to get to, And you don't have to be 10 in everything, perfect in everything.
That's true. I totally agree. Now, there is now we are almost getting at the end of our panel, unfortunately, but I have a question. Actually, I have two questions in one. Thinking about the practical side of our work as teachers. So I'd like to know what you have to say to teachers who are struggling in their classrooms with a student that has special learning needs, and also try to connect that with formative assessment, because we talked a lot about exams, but we know that formative assessment is essential and important in the classroom. So I'd like to listen to you about that, if you don't mind.
So I think formative assessment is very helpful for students overall. I mean, I think it's one of the most important types of assessment because that's where students get the most feedback at the particular stage they are at. It can be individualized. It can really support development and boost students for confidence, and that can drive learning forward. Summative assessment is has a lot of functions, you know, overall giving an overall proficiency estimate. Sometimes it has gatekeeping functions. It can prevent students from doing certain things. So formative assessment is very important, and teachers have a lot of freedom over formative assessment, I think, in their classrooms in most contexts. And they can adjust their feedback to the student. They can target it to the student where they are at the moment, and it doesn't necessarily always have to be at the standard that is set, let's say, by the curriculum, etc. So I know teachers do struggle, they have large class sizes, etc. But I think giving encouraging formative feedback that takes into account the student's strength and gives them ways to move forward is really helpful. So I think that can be done even with large class sizes. You're muted, Gladys.
I said, thank you. Miriam, would you like to add anything?
So I do agree again with Judy, and I also think that especially formative assessments in the classroom shouldn't be done only by the teacher. I insist that the neurotypic students have to participate. It'll help them understand his classmate, and it'll help them learn, because when you're teaching or when you're evaluating somebody, you're also learning. So I do insist that it's not only the teacher's responsibility to do the evaluations as well, not only teach, but also the classmates who can help and who can learn with the process together with the teacher, with the student with the disability. And I agree with Judy when she talks about summative assessment, which is a gatekeeper. And it has to be in a way, because, for instance, that deaf student who entered university and who didn't know how to read and write in Portuguese, but knew sign language, it had to be a gatekeeper. But remember, I think that we have to fight for equity and not equality. So we can have opportunities. Let's say the opportunity is not university, but it's something else more adequate for that student who only communicates with sign language. Let's look for it. Let's help him find himself something interesting. He would be happy and he would learn. So even if it's a gatekeeper, I think there's purpose and there are ways out to help these people be happy and do different things.
Thank you so much, Miriam and Judith. Our time, unfortunately, is over. I thank you so much for your generosity, for sharing your ideas, your studies, your experience with us. Judith, it was your first time in Brazil, and I'm sure everybody loved your talk. So thank you so much, and we hope to have you back in other events so that we can learn more from you. Miriam, the same. I've known Miriam for a long time, so I've been in touch with her, and I know what she's been doing, and she does a great job. So thank you so much, and thank you, Márcio, for the opportunity of being here with these two wonderful professors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you very much. So now, to close our morning, I would like to thank everybody, you attendees here in our event. Also, Judith, Gladys, Miriam, Fatima, it was a pleasure and an honor to have you all with us during this morning. I would like also to invite everyone for the sessions in the afternoon, which are going to start in 2 hours, in around 2 hours from now, depending on where you are. So if you're in Brazil, Brasilia time, it will start at 2:00 p.m. And I would like also to thank the support and partnership of Cambridge Assessment English our Brazilian and American offices. They have been great, and thank you very much, Cambridge English, for your constant support and helping us making this event possible.